Welcome to the 2023 Oscar preview show as presented by the Yay, Nay or Meh channel. This is a series of videos where I will be analysing the above the line categories at the 2023 Oscars. Even though I've been podcasting and reviewing films for over a decade now, I still consider myself an enthusiastic amateur rather than an expert. I didn't go to film school, I don't really have the training in it. This is the reason why I only do the major categories, because I honestly don't think I can give a value judgment as to what the best editing is, what the best production design is. But I do believe I can give value judgments about the best acting, the best directing, the best writing, and the best film. So that is why I only do the major categories. And I analyse the Oscars in a slightly different way than most people, because I spend almost as much time discussing what I think should have been nominated rather than what was nominated, and only limiting myself to that. And as such, these videos and in past years audio podcasts do get rather long. So what I've decided to do is split these reviews up into separate videos, and there will be one video for each category, where I will be discussing what I think will win, what I think should win, whether there were any snubs, and if there were any snubs, whether I personally think they should actually have won the Oscar. And in a couple of places I've gone really left field with what I think should win the Oscar. So this is going to be a long process. I mean, at the time of recording, it's less than a week away from the actual Oscar ceremony. So I need to be efficient and I need to be fast. And as such, I'm going to be reusing a lot of the same videos. This introduction I'm recording now will be on each of these videos. I mean, I need to introduce each of the videos in case you come across them individually. So I may as well just record one introduction and use it in each of the videos. And if you watch more than one of these, you'll be seeing this a lot. And as such, there will be a time code in the comments to tell you when the actual content starts. And when I will be talking about the same film in different categories, I'll also be reusing that video as well. So you will be seeing some repeats, but again, you can check in the time codes. And with such a vast project, you need a starting point. In certain categories, there is a shortlist. In both the documentary feature and the international feature categories, the Academy publishes a 15-film long list. And in the animated feature category, they publish a list of eligible films. And this year, there were 27 eligible animated features. But other than those categories with a specific list, the starting point that I use is the lists that are published on goldderby.com, which is basically the industry standard for this kind of Oscar preview and prediction. So if a performance or a film was listed on the Gold Derby lists of Oscar potential, there was a chance, however remote, that a performance or a film did have a chance at the Oscars. And that is the list I will be using, with a couple of tweaks which will come up during some of these videos. So that is my starting point, and if it wasn't published on goldderby.com, it's not going to be under consideration. And this has already gone on for far too long, so let's get on with this categories analysis.
Best Documentary. Nominee.
All That Breathes is a documentary that achieved the very impressive and, I believe, unique achievement of winning Best Documentary at both the Cannes Film Festival and the Sundance Film Festival. And that's quite an achievement, and I do understand why it happened. All That Breathes is a documentary following two brothers in Delhi who rescue black kites, birds of prey who live on the garbage heaps of Delhi. And these Muslim brothers, as part of Muslim charity, take it upon themselves to rescue, to save the black kite, which is threatened by all the pollution and the garbage in the rubbish-strewn alleys and streams of this very overpopulated portion of Delhi. So it's a film about environmentalism. It's also a film about the disturbing rise of Hindu nationalism, because by the end of the film, these Muslim brothers are under serious threat from a Hindu mob which has been whipped up by that very pleasant person, Narendra Modi. So it's all about sectarianism as well. So there's lots and lots of stuff that goes on in here, and I do understand why it got the praise it did. But All That Breathes is a documentary that's just not to my personal taste. In telling the story of these brothers, and telling the story of their environmentalist struggles and their sectarian struggles, I believe director Shaunak Sen spends far, far too much time creating artful shots of the garbage-choked streams and the rubbish-strewn alleys of Delhi. I mean, the film opens with a very, very long panning shot that just rotates around a crossroads in this rundown area of Delhi, and it's just absolutely covered in garbage. I mean, there's stray dogs in the background. There's little things that you realise, oh, that's just a mass of rats on the streets of Delhi. And that's just a very, very long rotating panning shot of this going on. And far, far too often, in my opinion, we have these kinds of artful shots. Look at the garbage, isn't it beautiful? And yeah, that's fine, but I would actually like a bit more information, a bit more details about these brothers, who are fascinating, and their struggle is fascinating. And eventually they get publicity, they get acclaim from international bird rescue organisations, and there's stuff about families as well. I mean, one brother has slightly different goals and ambitions than the other brother. All of that stuff is going on, and all of that stuff is fascinating. And also, I mean, we have a little bit about one of the brothers' wives who joins some protests against the government, against Narendra Modi and his Hindu nationalism. And we barely spend any time with that, and that's kind of fascinating. So, yeah, I mean, the actual documentary stuff, the actual factual stuff, in my opinion, is overshadowed and kind of smothered by this, artful stuff of isn't the garbage beautiful? And that just doesn't do it for me. So, yeah, I understand why this is so highly praised. I understand why it won those awards, why it's got this nomination. It's just not my kind of movie. For me, I would say that All That Breathes is good. I would call it a meh, but I don't think it deserved this Oscar nomination.
Best Documentary Nominee.
This is one of those films that has been getting universal acclaim, universal awards. Everybody seems to like it. I just don't get it. It tells the story of a husband and wife volcanologist team, Katya and Maurice Kraft, who dedicated their lives to photographing and filming erupting volcanoes, and eventually, and inevitably I suppose, died in a volcanic eruption in Japan in 1991. And this uses the Kraft's own footage to tell their story. The actual footage that the Kraft shot is unreal. It's extraordinary stuff. I mean, the imagery that they managed to get, I mean, the bubbling lava, the eruptions, even the people doing the scientific work in front of the eruptions. I mean, the footage is incredible. I mean, absolutely incredible, jaw-dropping stuff. But the filmmaker Sarah Dosa decided to bring this all together with a voiceover. A voiceover provided by Miranda July, of all people. I mean, that was an odd choice. And the words that Miranda July is saying puts the craft's life in a very poetic, a very metaphysical context. You're talking about how they loved the Earth and the Earth loved them back. I mean, isn't it incredible that these two people who were born 20 kilometres apart from each other, found their mutual passion, and dedicated their lives to their passion? I mean, yes, they were born 20 kilometres apart, so they both went to the University of Strasbourg, and they met at the University of Strasbourg. It's not that complicated. The Earth did not bring them together in some magical, metaphysical way. This voiceover, I have to say, really, really pissed me off. And I love Miranda July. I mean, Kajillionaire, I loved. She is a great director, as is her husband, Mike Mills. But this connection, trying to make something mystical, something magical about this, it actually strongly reminded me of the documentary work of Werner Herzog, which is totally ironic because Werner Herzog also made a documentary about the crafts. And his one is less Werner Herzog than Sarah Dosa's one, which is odd. But yeah, I mean, the voiceover just pissed me off so much. I was so annoyed with it that I just could not get on board fully with this film. But the footage that the crafts shot of erupting volcanoes and each other is so good, so special, so jaw-dropping. I can't fully dismiss it. So yes, watch it for the volcano footage, but the actual film itself, for me, it just pissed me off. So, good and bad. So for me, Fire of Love is a meh, but I don't think it deserved this nomination at the Oscars.
Best Documentary Nominee.
Usually, when the documentary feature long list is published, there's one completely random documentary on there which you have to say, what the hell's that? I've never heard of it. Most of these documentaries had some publicity behind them, had some backing, did the festival circuit, even got awarded at festivals. But usually there's one that sneaks onto the 15 film long list that you've never heard of, had no profile at all. And this one actually made it all the way to a nomination. I mean, I had never ever heard of this documentary, A House Made of Splinters, before it was on the 15 film long list for the Oscar. So, I mean, I looked it up, and as it turned out, it was available on the BBC4 Storyville documentary strand, which was handy. So I watched it, and yeah, it's fine. I mean, it tells the story of a temporary children's home where children who are the subject of court orders stay while the court case is resolved. This is not a children's home per se. This is a temporary solution while their parents are going through the courts. We follow 4 or 5 of these children, aging from about 12 to about 14, 15 maybe. And their stories are heartbreaking, they're tragic. I mean, the interactions between these children, I mean, as they try and form bonds with each other, try and have friendships with each other, and occasionally very inappropriate friendships. I mean, there's one boy who falls in with some slightly older boys, and you can just see he's going to end up a criminal. He's going to end up in jail, and there's very little that the runners of this home can do. So yeah, I mean, seeing a group of children for whom there is, unfortunately, very little future. I mean, there is some power to that. But in my opinion, I wouldn't necessarily say there is enough for being shortlisted for the Oscars, let alone being one of the nominees. I think one of the things that probably tipped this over to get an actual nomination is this children's home, this temporary children's home, is actually in eastern Ukraine. And this was filmed just before the invasion that Putin did at the beginning of 2022. So with that added layer of being in Ukraine, I think that probably tipped it over and got it an actual nomination. But I've seen documentaries like this many times in the past. I mean, yes, they are tragic, they are heartbreaking, it's well shot and everything like that. But I just don't think it's compelling enough to make it all the way to an Oscar nomination. And I think it was probably the fact it's in Ukraine that tipped it over. So, yeah, it's good, it's fine. It's a documentary, I mean, it's heartbreaking, as the subject matter would suggest. And it's well done. So, yeah, I think A House Made of Splinters is a solid meh. I don't think it deserved this Oscar nomination. It wasn't one of my picks, but it's a solid, if heartbreaking, documentary. And that's basically what you want from this kind of film.
Best Documentary. Snubbed.
Sometimes you have a situation where a filmmaker, in telling a very small story, in this case the story of the filmmaker's own family, manages to tell a much, much wider story and encapsulates everything about a certain subject. In this case, living as an Asian American in rural Michigan, in Bad Axe, Michigan, during 2020 under the pandemic and under Trump. David Siv grew up in Bad Axe, Michigan, the son of a Cambodian immigrant father and a Mexican-American mother. His father escaped the killing fields of Cambodia, and there's trauma there which he has not dealt with. But David Siv has grown up running this restaurant with his 3 siblings and his parents in Bad Axe, Michigan, a very rural, very Republican area of Michigan. And as the pandemic hits in the era of Trump, David Siv decides to leave New York, which is not the worst idea ever, go back home to Bad Axe, Michigan, and help out the restaurant. And since he's a filmmaker, he starts filming. He starts filming his family, who have all come back to Bad Axe, Michigan, and are all helping running this restaurant, in as much as you can run the restaurant when, there's a lockdown. And being a restaurateur, being a business owner, as an Asian American in a very, very Trump-supporting region, Huron County, Michigan, in 2020, it manages to encapsulate everything about modern America, in my opinion. I think in exploring how these people are treated, how they treat each other, I mean, David Siv's older sister is a very, very type A personality who takes over everything and clashes with her equally type A father. And David Siv is there with his camera capturing everything. And how this family survives, how this restaurant survives, in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of the not unreasonable insistence on wearing masks. As soon as the Black Lives Matter movement kicks up, the restaurant does support it, even though the father says, we shouldn't get involved, we don't want to cause trouble. But the younger generation insists upon it. And at this Black Lives Matter march, this family confronts people who turn out to be actual Nazis. And doesn't that say everything about modern America? And yeah, in telling the story of an Asian American family living under Trump, living under COVID, and trying desperately to survive, trying desperately to stay together, it tells everything. I think this is a really, really good film. I have no idea whether this is ever going to be legally available here in the UK. I mean, I had to get it through extra-legal means. Maybe it will show up on television at some point. Maybe it's unlikely it will show up at the cinemas. But if you do ever get the chance to watch this film, Bad Axe, I strongly recommend it. I think it's an excellent documentary which tells such a wide story by telling such a narrow story. And it really, really works. And I think Bad Axe is an excellent documentary, and I do think it should have got an Oscar nomination for Best Documentary Feature. And it is a yay.
Best Documentary. Snubbed.
This category is notoriously difficult to predict. But if there was one upset, if there was one surprise on Oscar nomination day, it was the fact that this documentary, Descendant, didn't get onto the nomination list. It had a high profile. It's on a hot button issue. It's about race relations. And it's also on Netflix. And Netflix documentaries tend to have a bit of a leg up on their competition, simply due to access. Most Academy members have access to Netflix. They can just click the button and watch it and consider it. A couple of times over recent years, a Netflix documentary has got onto the nomination list, and I was thinking, really, that? But Netflix helps. So yeah, Descendant was expected to get a nomination, and it didn't. But I think it deserves it, because this is another one of those special documentaries which is trying to tell a small story, and in doing so, tells a much wider story. It's about the descendants of the last slave ship which landed on US soil carrying enslaved people from Africa. This was many years after it was illegal to bring slaves from Africa to the United States, but a businessman in Mobile, Alabama, took a wager and said, I bet I can get some slaves, some African people, to Mobile, Alabama, and he did it. And then only a year later, after the end of the Civil War, all these slaves were freed, and they managed to get themselves some land to the north of Mobile, Alabama, which they started calling Africatown. And the descendants of these original slaves who still live in Africatown passed down the oral history, passed down the legend of this last slave ship, the Clotilde, which landed on US soil. And then a concerted effort is made to find the Clotilde, which as soon as it landed and the slaves disembarked, it was scuttled and burned because, evidence of a capital crime. So the burnt remains of the Clotilde have been searched for many years. I mean, there's lots of legends and all that kind of stuff. But a concerted effort was made to find the Clotilde. And what happens when you find it? What happens when the black residents of Africatown want certain things done with it? The descendants of the slave owners don't want anything to do with it, and some of the richest people in Mobile, Alabama, still have the name of that illegal slave owner. So the political system doesn't want this dealt with. Nobody wants this dealt with, or certainly the white population doesn't want this dealt with. And in having these discussions, you really get an encapsulation of race relations throughout the centuries, throughout the generations, and what it means now. And in telling the story of Africatown through the prism, through the filter of this slave ship, the Clotilde, we also get a profile of Africatown itself and what has been done to it down the years by the white population of Mobile, Alabama. This is a tiny, tiny residential zoning surrounded by heavy, heavy industry. The incidences of cancer in Africatown are substantially higher than the population at large. And who cares? It's just the black community. We can do whatever we want with the land around it. We can gradually encroach on this land, which was so hard fought for and so hard won back in the late 19th century. And who cares? It's just the black community. And that kind of attitude, which is still going on to this day, is explored in this film Descendant. So, in telling the small story of the Clotilde and the descendants of the Clotilde in Africatown, we also have a wider story, a wider context for the race relations in America, particularly in a place like Mobile, Alabama. So yeah, Descendant is an excellent documentary. It really gives you an overview of race relations through a really interesting prism. And I am surprised it didn't get a nomination as Best Documentary Feature, because I think it deserved it. I think Descendant is a yay, and I do think it should have been nominated for the Oscar.
Best Documentary. Snubbed.
Matthew Heineman has a death wish. I first came across this phenomenon when I watched his 2016 documentary Cartel Land. It was a documentary where he embedded himself in all sides of the Mexican narco wars. He hung out with vigilantes who were trying to protect their communities from the cartels. He embedded himself with the incredibly corrupt Mexican police force, and he embedded himself with the cartels themselves. There are so many scenes in Cartel Land of the filmmaker still filming as bullets are flying everywhere. I mean, I have never been so genuinely afraid for the safety and the security of a film crew as I was when I was watching Cartel Land. And then last year, Matthew Heineman came out with a documentary which had a death wish in a slightly different way. Because his documentary, The First Wave, which was on last year's 15 film long list for Oscar consideration, was in a New York hospital, a very large, very busy New York hospital at the beginning of COVID, the first wave of COVID. So, as New York is being absolutely devastated by COVID, and there are bodies piling up outside, Matthew Heineman and his crew were inside filming. So yeah, that's a death wish in a different way. And now for this latest film, Retrograde. Matthew Heineman decides to document the last few months of the American occupation of Afghanistan. As we start the film, we have 12 US Green Berets who are training a group of about 15,000 Afghan soldiers at a military base in Afghanistan. But soon, President Biden confirms the intention of President Trump in completely withdrawing from Afghanistan. So within 10 days, these Green Berets leave Afghanistan. And that's only about the first third of the movie. The rest of the movie follows the Lieutenant General of this Afghan military base, a guy named Lieutenant General Sami Sadat. And as the Americans leave, he desperately tries to keep his country together, but as we all know, it didn't work. And this is another one of those documentaries where it is boots on the ground, reportage of history as it is being made. This is a film, again, where the bullets are flying everywhere. You are genuinely concerned for the safety and security of the crew, and also the safety and security of Afghanistan, because seeing how everything went so badly wrong from the perspective of an Afghan army general, it's just devastating, it's harrowing. And the final sequences of this film, well, actually it's a framing device. We have a little bit at the beginning and then we come back to it at the end. The desperate people at Kabul airport who are trying to get out of the country because the Taliban are just about to take over. I mean, it is an utter tragedy. And this film doesn't shy away from the fact it is a tragedy and how badly America has fucked over Afghanistan for the past 20 odd years. One of the repeated things which his subordinates keep saying to General Sadat is, we desperately, desperately need ammunition because the Taliban are so better armed than us. And in an earlier scene, the Americans, the 12 Green Berets, we see them destroying mountains of ammunition. Because in a retrograde move, i.e. retreat, it's policy that you don't leave ammunition behind. So even though this Afghan army desperately needs ammunition, we've seen the Americans destroy it. And just how badly the Americans fucked over Afghanistan is painful to see. And I mean, as has always been the way. I mean, Afghanistan is not known as the graveyard of empires for nothing. This is a devastating, harrowing, difficult film to watch. Given the weird circumstances of current streaming society, you can find this on Disney Plus, because this is a National Geographic documentary. So this utterly devastating, utterly tragic, utterly harrowing documentary you can find on Disney Plus. I fully understand if you don't want to watch this. I mean, I was reluctant to watch it. I mean, I felt an obligation to watch it since it was on the 15 film long list. It is harrowing, it is devastating, and I do understand if you don't want to watch it. But for what it is an exceptional piece of work. I mean, showing the absolute chaos, the absolute tragedy of the Taliban taking over Afghanistan, and how powerless, very dedicated people were to stop it. I mean, Sami Sadat, I mean, he's a little bit arrogant, he's possibly got a little bit of hubris, but he is genuinely trying to save his country, and he can't. And there were cameras there to see it. I mean, this is history in front of us. And it's very, very well done. So, yeah, I do think that Retrograde, directed by Matthew Heineman, deserved an Oscar nomination for Best Documentary Feature, and it is a yay.
Best Documentary will win.
All the Beauty and the Bloodshed is a documentary that I think is trying to do two separate things at the same time, and I think it basically achieves it. This is a film from the Oscar-winning documentarian Laura Poitras about the artist Nan Goldin, who is a photographer, was famous in the 80s talking about and taking photographs of the Times Square area with all the prostitutes and queer people and all the seedy underbelly of New York, and she photographed it and was famous for it. But also developed a opioid problem after surgery. And most of this film is talking about Nan Goldin campaigning against the Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma and invented OxyContin. I mean, and this one family can largely be blamed for the opioid crisis in America. And to freshen up their name, they started donating to art galleries and universities and museums. And, the Sackler Gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the Guggenheim, at the Tate in London, at the Louvre in Paris, all of these donations to art galleries around the world had the Sackler name on them. And Nan Goldin said, no, if you want to show my work, take the Sackler name down. And she started campaigning and was largely successful. So most of this film is this campaign of Nan Goldin trying to get the Sackler name off these art galleries. And the other half is kind of a biography of Nan Goldin, telling her own life story in the style of her art, which I think is the genius move that Laura Poitras made. I mean, as I said, Nan Goldin does photographs, and what she became famous for is slideshows. I mean, putting all these photographs she'd taken of her and her friends in, the seedy New York of 1980s, and making slideshows, projecting them wherever they would have them. Different music, different arrangement of the photographs. It was a different experience every time. So what Nan Goldin has done is basically make slideshows for this movie and telling her own story in her own art style. And I think that was a genius move, because I'm not an art guy. I know something about classic art, but modern art, and particularly photography, I know nothing. I'd never heard of Nan Goldin before this. And what this documentary does, which a good documentary should do, is tell us why a film has been made about this person. Tell us why we should be interested in about this person, and why we should care about this person. And I think Laura Poitras's documentary does a very, very good job of that, by showing her campaign and showing the civil disobedience, the activism that she's doing, doing these protests, these very public disruptions of these art galleries, showing that, and showing her own story and her tragic backstory. I mean, what happens to Nan Goldin's sister is absolutely horrifying. And we hear that, we see that in these slideshows from Nan Goldin's own photographs. So, yeah, it's a biography of the artist in the artist's own style, and it's a documentary about this activism. Both of them work together, and I really, really did like All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. It does seem to be one of the favourites to win this category. I mean, the documentary feature category is notoriously difficult to predict, but I think that All the Beauty and the Bloodshed is going to win the Oscar. I mean, it seems to be a toss-up between two films, but I think All the Beauty and the Bloodshed is actually going to win the Oscar. I'm not confident in it at all, but that's my choice. And regardless of whether it wins the Oscar or not, All the Beauty and the Bloodshed is an excellent documentary. I highly recommend it, and for me, it is a yay.
Best documentary. Should win.
Alexander Navalny is a figure who I think has been somewhat overshadowed over the last couple of years by other things which are going on in his native Russia. I mean, the invasion of Ukraine, the international condemnation of Vladimir Putin, all those things going on. The fact that this guy, Alexander Navalny, for several years was a legitimate opposition figure against Vladimir Putin, was trying desperately to promote a free Russia, was trying to be an opponent to Putin to such a degree that he ended up getting poisoned by Novichok and nearly dying. And yeah, I mean, somebody who is willing to do that, is willing to put himself in the firing line, is somebody to admire on one level. But also, you have to question certain things he's done. And this documentary, I think, does examine Alexander Navalny, because here is this figure who, yes, does want to take down Putin on a lot of levels. He is a legitimate, purposeful opponent to Putin. On the other hand, he wants to oust Putin so much, he's willing to share a stage, share a podium with anybody who wants Putin out, including outright Nazis. I mean, this is a complex character. And this film explores that, and explores it in a really, really interesting way. And the bravery, or even the hubris, that Alexander Navalny showed. I mean, when he recovered from this Novichok attack in Germany, he went back to Russia. He knew full well what the consequences would probably be, but he went back to Russia. And seeing that happen, I mean, having cameras actually on the airplane as Navalny is going into Russia, this is history as it is being made. And that is one of the things I really like in a documentary, and I've been talking about that in other places. But this is history being made in front of us, which is something I really like, and I've talked about already in this section. Seeing all of this happens, being on the airplane, seeing Alexander Navalny going through these things and having the arrogance. I mean, honestly, he is quite an arrogant guy, but possibly you need that arrogance in order to make this stand. And he's a complex figure. But the one thing that really, really pushes this documentary over the top for me, there's one scene in this documentary which is just so jaw-dropping. I can't believe it happened, and I can't believe it was caught on camera by the documentarian Daniel Roher. Alexander Navalny manages to get a phone call with one of the people who poisoned him. And this guy on the other end of the phone, I mean, he thinks he's talking to one of his bosses, but it's being recorded, and eventually Navalny not only blogged it and puts it on YouTube, but it's in this documentary. This guy goes point by point by point. How it was done, why it was done, where it was done, why it didn't work. Everything is laid out in a phone conversation to the guy it actually happened to. When I saw that unfolding in front of me, it was like, what the fuck? I mean, that is just such a jaw-dropping scene. I mean, that's the thing that makes me say, I think this should win the Oscar. And I think it's got a very, very strong chance. I really do think it's a toss-up between Navalny and All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, and maybe Fire of Love as an outside shot. I mean, as I have repeatedly said, it's very, very hard to predict the Oscars in the documentary feature category. It's often quite impossible. Apart from last year, I mean, everybody knew that Summer of Soul was going to win, but usually it's very, very hard. And this is a hard decision to make, but my personal choice, my favourite, is Navalny. I think this is an outstanding documentary, a portrait of a very complex figure who nevertheless is very important and very brave and all those things, as well as being quite arrogant. It's a really, really fascinating documentary, and I think it's the best documentary out of this crop. I think Navalny should win the Oscar. I think it might actually win the Oscar, but I definitely think it should win the Oscar, and it's an unqualified yay. In the Best Documentary category, the actual nominees are All That Breathes, All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, Fire of Love, A House Made of Splinters, and Navalny. My personal list of nominees would be All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, Bad Axe, Descendant, Navalny, and Retrograde. I think what will win the Oscar is All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. But equally likely to actually win the Oscar, and my personal choice to win the Oscar, is Navalny. And as I leave you with some honourable mentions in this category, which I think are worthy of note, a reminder that I have several more videos in this playlist which analyse different categories at the 2023 Oscars. You can check those out if you desire, even though if you watch enough of them you will have to skip some pieces of footage that I reused, including this closing statement. I am planning to do a reaction video to the Oscars themselves. I haven't quite figured out the technicals of that, but we'll have to see how that goes. And if you appreciate the kinds of things that I'm doing, I have an audio podcast, and I have various other things on this channel that you might want to check out. So you can like, comment, subscribe if you wish. And basically, that's all I have for this particular video. So I'll see you next time, where I shine a light on cinema, both obvious and obscure.